everybody. Have you ever had one of those days where nothing seems to go right? Oh my goodness, I've been having one of those days. But it's story time. And since I was having a day like that, I thought of a story that's kind of like that. This is a story of stone soup. Once, long ago, there had been a very big war in the land. And the war was over now, and the soldiers were being sent home. And three of the soldiers, they had become pretty good friends, so they decided to travel home together. But you see, when there's a war in the land, the people in the land, when the army comes through the town, they take a lot of the food and things so that the army can eat. And the people in the towns and the villages start to hide their food because they don't want the army to take everything, so they want to have food left to eat when everything's done. Well, these three soldiers, they were traveling home. And as they walked down the road, they said to each other, you know what would really be nice? What would really be nice is to have a bed to sleep in tonight. And another soldier, one of the other soldiers said, you know what would be really nice is to have a nice warm meal tonight. And the third soldier said, but you know we're not going to get it, so we'll just have to keep on marching. And so they did. They kept on walking towards home. And as it was getting towards the middle of the afternoon, right about now, they were walking down the road and they saw what looked like maybe a village ahead of them. And as they got closer, they realized it was a village. And they thought maybe they'll have a bed or a loft that we could sleep in. And maybe somebody would be willing to give us some food. That would be wonderful. They hadn't eaten in 2 whole days. They were very hungry. Well, the villagers were used to the war and the army coming through. And so they kept some of the kids on the outside of the village, near the edges of the village, that would come and warn them if there were soldiers coming. Well, the children came running into the village. There are soldiers coming. There are soldiers coming. And all of the people in town quickly gathered up all of their food and they hid it. They put all of the carrots in the bin and they put a quilt over the top so it looked like a cushion or a box full of blankets. And they took their cabbages and they stuck them underneath the bed and they put some things in front of them so that nobody would know there were cabbages under there. And they took the buckets of milk and they lowered them down into the well so that nobody would know that they had any milk. There was just, the bucket was way down there in the well where nobody would see it. And they took their meat and they took it down to their basements and they hung it up in the basement so that nobody would know that they had meat. And when those three soldiers got to the village, they knocked on the first door. And when the person came to the door, they said, we're very hungry and we're looking for some place to sleep. Might you have a little bit of bread or something that we could have and maybe a loft we could sleep in? And the people from the house looked at them and said, no, I'm sorry. We don't have any extra food. We haven't had any food ourselves for 3 days. They lied. We haven't had any food for 3 days, and we don't have a loft, sorry. So the soldiers said, okay, and they went to the next house, and they knocked on the door, and they asked the same question, and the people there said, oh, I'm so sorry. We don't have any extra food. We just have a little bit, just enough for our own suppers, and there aren't any extra beds in our house, and we don't have a loft. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And the soldiers went on to the next house. And you know what? Every single house in the village, it was the same thing. There were no beds available. Nobody had a loft that the soldiers could sleep in. And there was no extra food. Everybody had a good excuse. One had a sick father they had to take care of. Another one had had a bad harvest and they had to save all of the food for planting. But nobody had any extra food, and nobody had any extra place for these soldiers to sleep. While the people of the village were kind of standing around in the street, trying their best to look hungry and kind of keeping an eye on those soldiers. They wanted to know if they were going to stick around or if they were going to leave. Well, the 3 soldiers, they got to the end of the village and they huddled together and they said, there is no way that this village is as hungry as they're saying they are. There's got to be a way that we could get just a loaf of bread from these people or something. And they talked amongst themselves and they came up with a plan. And they turned back around and they went back into the village and they said, good people, we understand that you don't have enough food and you don't have any extra places to sleep. So since you can't feed us, we're going to help you get food. And the people all looked at each other. Where were these soldiers going to come up with food? They said, we are going to make stone soup. It's the only thing we can do. And the people were surprised. They had never heard of soup made out of stones before, but it could be very useful if they knew how to do it. And so they asked the soldiers, how do you make soup from stones? And the soldiers said, well, the first thing we need is a great big pot. The biggest pot you can possibly find. We're going to make enough soup for everybody. So the soldiers said, the people from the village said, I think we have just the thing. And they went off and they got the biggest pot they could find. And they brought it back and they set it up in the middle of the square. And the soldiers said, now we need fire and we need water to fill the pot. And so they went over to the well and they had plenty of water. They went to the well and they got enough water and they filled that pot, and it took a lot of water. But they filled that pot with water and they lit a fire underneath, and pretty soon that water started to bubble and to boil. Well, the soldiers said, now what we need is 3 big round stones. And they went out and they found 3 big round stones and they brought them back and they dropped them plop into the pot. Townspeople were watching. They were very surprised by this. They'd never seen anybody make soup out of stones. They really wanted to know how this was done. And the soldiers stood there with the spoon and they were stirring the soup, the water, with its stones in it. And they said, you know what every soup needs? Every soup needs salt and pepper. And several of the mothers said, we have plenty of that. So they sent their children off to the house to get the salt and pepper. They brought it back and they put lots of salt and pepper in the pot. They stirred it up. They said, now this is turning into a really good soup here, but stone soup is always better with carrots. But you know what? You don't have carrots, so we're not going to worry about it. It'll be okay. And one of the ladies said, actually, I might have a carrot or 2. And she went home and she took the blanket off of the bin full of carrots and she filled her apron with carrots and she brought back a full apron full of carrots. And the soldiers took those carrots and they very wisely didn't say anything. And they cut up those carrots into the pot and they stirred it up some more and they said, what would really make this soup really good is if we had a cabbage or 2. But, no use asking for what you don't have. It'll be fine without it. And one of the people said, I might have a cabbage or 2 at home. Let me go check. And so he went home and he came back with a couple of cabbages from underneath the bed. And he gave the cabbages to the soldiers and they chopped them up and they put them in the pot. And then the soldiers said, let's see now. We've carrots, we have cabbages, we have our stones, of course, salt and pepper. You know what would be really tasty in this soup? is if we had a few potatoes. You know, maybe some green beans. Yeah, that would be really tasty. But you know what? Let's not ask for what we don't have. Well, as you might expect, a few of the townspeople suddenly remembered that they did have some potatoes and some green beans at home, and they went home and they fetched them and they brought them back. The soldiers cut them up and put them in the pot, and they stirred the pot. It was starting to smell pretty tasty. And they were stirring the pot up, and they said, you know, this soup would be a lot better with some beef in it and maybe a little bit of milk and some barley. The king really, really liked this soup when we put those things in it, but no use in asking for what we don't have, so we'll just do with what we have. And they stirred it up. And sure enough, a few of the townspeople remembered the beef that was hanging in their cellars, and the barley that they had stuck underneath the bales of hay, and the potatoes that were hidden underneath the bed. And so they went and they fetched some, and they brought them back, and the soldiers cut them up, and they put them into the pot. And they brought the milk out of the well, and they put some milk into the pot. And it was really starting to smell delicious. And the townspeople simply couldn't believe that someone could make such a wonderful soup out of just a couple of stones. Well, pretty soon the soldiers said, we think it's getting close to being done, but you know, if we're going to eat this, why don't we make a fun party out of it? Is there any chance we could maybe get some tables or something set up out here? And so the townspeople brought out a whole bunch of tables and some barrels, and they put boards across the top, and they made enough table space for everybody to sit down, and they put torches up around the outside, and they sat down to have their soup. Well, as the soldiers were starting to dish it out, they said, you know what would be really tasty? I mean, if we're going to make a party out of this, you know, it would be really nice if we had some bread to go with the soup, and maybe even some cider or some wine or something like that. And well, of course, a couple of the townspeople remembered that they had bread and they had cider and they had wine and they had some other things that could go with the soup as well. And so they went and they got all of their food and all of their drinks, and they brought them out, and they had a big feast in the village square. And the people were enjoying that delicious stone soup that was made out of just a few stones. Who knew? And all of the wonderful food and the drink that they had. And when they were done eating and drinking, somebody brought out the musical instruments and they started dancing. And so they were dancing and they were singing and they were feasting and they were having fun. Well, at the end of the night, the soldiers said, you know, it's really hard work making stone soup. Might somebody maybe have a loft that we could sleep in for the night? Oh, well, goodness, no. There was no way those people in that town were going to let these wonderful soldiers who had taught them all about how to make stone soup sleep in a loft. No. They needed to sleep in the best beds in town. So one of them went home with the baker, and one of them went home with the priest, and another one went home with the mayor. And they all slept in nice soft beds for that night with nice full bellies. And the next morning when they got up, all of the townspeople gathered together to say goodbye to them and to thank them for teaching them to make stone soup, because now the village would never have to go hungry again. And so the soldiers shook everyone's hand and waved goodbye and walked off down the roads headed toward their home with nice full bellies and having slept in a nice soft bed that night. And that is the story of stone soup. I hope you enjoyed it. We will see you again on Friday at 3 p.m. Central Daylight Time and the Milledgeville Public Library Facebook page. And we will have another story for you then. See you later.